Thank you, and thank you guys for coming. I'm really excited to be here. This is the first time I've done SciPop, and so it looks like a lot of fun. So, so I'm really excited to talk today about the science of self and my research on gender bias and your inner scientist. So before I get started, I wanted to just say that I'm a social scientist, and scientists never work alone. We stand on the shoulders of giants, right? And I've been very fortunate to be part of a research team funded by the National Institute of Health. They're amazing people, and through this grant, we've been able to work in schools, bring science programming to middle schools, elementary schools, high schools, to create some really awesome, engaging comic books and sticker books, and to do the research that we've done. So I just wanted to thank the PIs on our grant, Judy Diamond, Charles Wood, and Julia McQuillan. And then also just to thank all of the undergraduate and graduate student researchers who have contributed to this research that I'm going to present today. So before I get started, I just want to talk a little bit about what is sociology. So sociology is the scientific study of society. And so really what we're looking at is human behavior. And so in science, when human behavior enters the equation, things become nonlinear. And Neil deGrasse Tyson says, that's what makes physics easy and sociology hard. I actually think physics is pretty hard. But it is hard studying human behavior because humans are really unpredictable. But I really enjoy it. It's very fascinating and interesting research. So sociology falls under a larger umbrella of social science, criminology, economics, anthropology, and psychology. A lot of people seem to be more familiar with psychology. And so the difference here is that with psychology, we're really interested in understanding the sort of internal workings of the mind, why people do what they do, understanding personalities, and things like that. In sociology, what we're interested in is understanding social interaction. So this can be at the micro level, understanding human interaction through language, through play, through interactions in families. But it can also be at a larger level, thinking about schools, thinking about larger social groups, thinking about politics, and then, of course, the world. And so one of our most famous sociologists, C. Wright Mills, coined the term the sociological imagination. And so sociology can be thought of as sort of the intersection of biography and history. So trying to think about how individuals find themselves and how their behavior is impacted by their social context, their environment, by their social interactions with the people around them, by the larger political system, and by their place in history and that historical context. And so one of the things that I love about the sociological imagination is just thinking about the individual the individual problems versus the larger social problems. And when we talk about this, what we're talking about is just private troubles versus public issues. And I think that this can be a really great lens to sort of view the world and to think about the individual problems we face and how they might actually be larger social problems. So an example of this, really quickly, is, for example, bullying is an area where if you're experiencing it, it feels like a very personal, it is very personal, an impactful experience that you're having in the world. If you're thinking about it at the individual level, you might look to yourself and say, why is this happening to me? What did I do to deserve this? You might feel very alone in the world. But when we look at bullying as a public issue, you can start to see that actually you aren't alone. That there is a pattern, a larger social pattern to bullying. And there has been a lot of research, recent social science research, related to what types of bullying people experience, to what extent they experience it, when in the life course they experience it. And I think that that's really empowering because if you are experiencing something like that, this very personal trouble, being able to view it as a public issue, then you might not feel so alone. And then you can start to think about, well, what is it that contributes to bullying? And what can we do? What can we do about bullying? If you're thinking about it at an individual level, you might think there's nothing you can do. But if you're thinking about it at a social level, as a social problem, as a public issue, then you can start to say, well, look at these patterns. What can we do? And what we've learned in the social science research is that bullying varies greatly by school, and that there are things that we can do to limit bullying. And I think we've seen that over the course of the last couple of decades, that bullying has changed and that we're addressing that, something that we used to think is a private trouble, and we're addressing it as a public issue. Okay, so let's switch gears from bullying and think about the topic at hand, which is women in science. So this is a primary area of research for me. And you might think of women in science as a private trouble in the sense that people just have their individual inclinations on what careers they want to have. But you might also view it as a public issue. And so I just want you to use your sociological imagination and think about why people choose the careers they choose, and why people might go into science, and why women might go into science or not. So why study women in science? Is this a problem? So first of all, one of the reasons is that we have a need for people with technological skills in our workforce. We are not providing the workers of the future. We are needing to train people in these technological skills in our rapidly advancing society. So there's a great need to increase the workforce in science. The other reason is that there's an underrepresentation of women in science. So what I mean by that is that women make up 50% of the population, right? In some science fields, they're only 13%. So when we see that it's not 50-50 in those fields, then we say, well, there's an underrepresentation of women. And then we want to know why. Why is there an underrepresentation in those fields? So looking at it from a sociological way, some of the things that we do is we look at place. So just looking over on the left side here first, we can see that in different countries, in different places, that the proportion of women in science differs. So you can see here, women are in orange and men are in teal. In the Netherlands, women are much less likely to go into science fields. They're very underrepresented. In Argentina, there's parity. It's about 50-50, like we would expect. And you can see the United States is somewhere in between there. And so we see these variations by place. And as sociologists thinking about why, well, what is it about Argentina? What is it about Norway? And what can we do to increase the proportion of women in these fields? Because we need people in these fields. Looking to this side, we can see that it's not that there's a difference in ability. Generally, this is PISA science scores, which are high school. Men and women are achieving at the same rates in science, but they're not going into careers in science at the same rates. So that's not it. It's something else. There's something else going on here. Another thing that we do in sociology is, so we'll look from place to place to see if there's variation, and then we look over time. So the chart that you have here, that I have here, is showing the proportion of women in different scientific disciplines from 1990 to 2013. And so you can see right away that most all of them are under 50%. So we have underrepresentation of women here. Except we're getting pretty close with biological sciences. And you can see there's been some increases over time with women in the biological sciences. So what's happening there? Similarly, chemists, there's fewer, but we can see an increase over time. Engineering is this one down here on the bottom. It's increasing, but not by much. Only 9% of women were engineers in 1990. It's 12% today. So we need engineers. And so this is an opportunity that we have to increase engineers by recruiting more women into engineering. One of the most interesting fields where we see a difference is with computer science. So computer science was a field, if you've ever seen Hidden Figures, where women, and even women of color especially, were representative in this field a few decades ago. And what we've seen is over time, it's actually gone down. Now this is a little weird because women in the workforce, whether you're talking about lawyers, judges, we've seen an increase. So to see this go down, it's really fascinating. What's going on with computer science in particular? So one of the ways we think about this is thinking about increasing or figuring out why women don't go into science fields is this analogy or just this idea of a leaky pipeline. And so what we find is when we look at youth And we see, looking at elementary school students, that their interest in science and their engagement in science are pretty similar. It's about 50, they're all very interested at the same rates. But as we move through the life course, up through middle school, up through high school, to college, and then as we get into graduate school, PhD degrees, and leadership positions, there's just this leak of women out of science. And we have to figure out, based on that place in the life course, why that might be. So if there are leaks, how do we fill those leaks? And I think it depends on where we're talking about in the life course. If we're looking at the faculty level, some of the research I've done is looking at motherhood and marriage and dual career couples. If we're looking at the earlier years, we see here that what we're trying to focus on is just engaging all students in K through 9, right? In 7 through 12, it's about recruiting, getting them to think about possible careers that they might be interested in science. Once we get into the later stages, retaining people in those science courses, careers, and majors, and then finally getting them through into those science jobs and advanced research positions. So the area that I'm interested in is where the leak begins to happen, and that is right here between K through 9 and 7 through 12. The reason I'm interested in that area is because, as I mentioned, in elementary school, students, boys and girls, have similar interest in science, but by 8th grade, girls have dropped, and we want to know why. So most of my research, or at least the research I'm presenting today, is focused on middle school. So I'd like for you, just for a moment, to think about your experience of middle school. Think of a couple of adjectives, how you might describe it in just a few words. And then I'd like you to just tell your partner, somebody next to you, what it was like. Was it positive? Was it negative? What do you think? Does anybody want to share? Who here thinks that middle school was the best time of your life? I'm really lucky. My daughter loved middle school. I don't know what happened. She had a great middle school. She's a 9th grader now. She misses it a lot, so that's great. For how many of you, sir, you over here, what did you think about middle school?
I said it was the worst years of my life. Yeah.
Anybody else feel that way about middle school? Yeah, it's interesting because I work with middle schoolers and think about this a lot. And why is middle school such a tough time? And I think there's a lot of different reasons. So first of all, it's really different than elementary school, right? If you think about it structurally, you're going from usually a much smaller school that's more local to a bigger school. The class structure is different. In elementary school, you're there usually with 1 or 2 same teachers and your peers are the same. You're not switching classrooms. Where in middle school, suddenly you have a science class and a science teacher for the first time, and a social studies teacher and a social studies class. So there's that structural, formal educational component. Another component is just physically. This is the time when kids go through puberty, or at least they start going through puberty, right? And that's a really hard time for kids. It's a really hard time for kids because their bodies are changing, and it's a really hard time for kids because people are reacting to that in their world differently. And so there's that going on. So there's that. It's also a time where social interactions and peers become more important. You still probably care a little bit what your parents think, but man, it really matters all of a sudden in middle school what your peers think. So there's that aspect as well. Then the other thing is just not just physical growth is happening, not just very rapid physical growth, but cognitive growth. So your brain grows during this period. The only comparison would be in early infancy. It's just huge cognitive growth. And so much is happening in middle school. And at the same time, and this is happening for boys and girls, but at the same time, this is when we're seeing science interest in girls drop. Okay, so some of you might not know this, but we have a cultural bias against girls in science in our society. And how do we know this? There's an implicit association test that's been done by thousands of people. And so when I say implicit, what I mean is usually none of us are explicitly thinking boys are better at science or math. Some might, and some might actually express that out loud. But for the most part, we are not even aware that there's this cultural bias. But we know there is. So even people who will say, I'm not biased at all, and I've taken this test, and I'm a sociologist, and I know all of this, and I'm biased. And lots of us are, as you can see. A vast majority of us have this cultural bias towards men in science and women in liberal arts, so think reading, English, things like that. So we know this exists in our culture. In middle school, we see this cognitive sort of shift where students suddenly start to imagine their place in the world and what social groups they fit in. Where they fit in, where they stand out, where they belong, where they don't belong. And we also see these sort of generalizations start to happen as well. So here we see just generally two people, this individual sucks at math, I don't know, they got the question wrong, and the person makes a judgment. But when we see, a boy and a girl, and we see that this girl's not doing well in math, well, suddenly girls, it's a confirmation bias. Girls don't do as well at math. So this generalization happens. And we see this happen in middle school, this sort of generalization of in-group, out-group, thinking about how that works. So we did a study in a middle school, and we couldn't do the implicit association test because it takes too long. So we just asked them, who's better? Who's better at science, girls or boys? And I think the positive story here is that the vast majority say girls and boys are the same. Now, we know implicitly they probably have bias, like we all do. But when you ask them, there's this equity, which I think is good. We also see that there's some girl bias, right? So, and we see that there is some boy bias as well. And I'll tell you that girls tend to be more girl bias, and boys tend to be more boy bias. And I call this the girls rule, boys drool type phenomenon, this intersex sort of competition that happens in elementary school and middle school. So just shifting gears a little bit, I want to look at the cultural belief that boys are better at science in particular. So what we did is we wanted to predict boy science bias in particular, and we wanted to look at it by gender, and we wanted to look at it by grade. Now, this is just a cross-sectional study, so this wasn't over time, but we are breaking it down looking at what the boy gender bias in 6th grade is for boys and girls, what it is for 7th grade for boys and girls, and what it is in 8th grade for boys and girls. So as you can see in 6th grade, boys have a much higher boy science bias, explicit boy science bias, than girls. The 7th graders, we see that the girls' boy science bias increases and the boys goes down just a little bit. And then by 8th grade, they really look the same. Now again, this is just like a cross-section. We'd have to follow them through to see how that bias changes, but it is a really fascinating pattern because we know that the transition between 6th, 7th, and 8th grade is huge. And you know this if you've ever been in a middle school and you've seen the 6th graders and the 8th graders. So a lot happens in those 3 years. So at this point, we're really interested, well, how does this impact this explicit science bias, boy science bias? How does this impact whether someone thinks that they could become a scientist someday? So we call this science possible selves. And it's just this idea that, is this a future possibility for me? We know that middle schoolers are trying on all sorts of identities. They're thinking about all sorts of possibilities for their future, what's going to be open to them and what's not open to them. And so not everybody wants to be a scientist. That's okay. We need artists, we need all sorts of different people. But we did ask, so let's pretend you wanted to be a scientist when you grow up. Which of the following best describes you? And I could become a scientist. I might be able to become a scientist. Probably, and then I don't think so. And then also, I don't know. Middle schoolers love to say, I don't know. What we found is about 23% of the students said that they could become a scientist if they wanted to. So how does boy science bias or girl science bias impact whether someone thinks they could themselves be a scientist? We weren't really sure. So if you think about it, if I'm a girl, and I think girls are like way better at science, then you'd think that I might believe that it's a greater possibility for me than other people. Same for boys. If I'm a boy and I have a strong boy science bias, then I might have a higher boy science possible self. and then vice versa. If I'm a girl and I think boys are better at science, then I think it's probably not a possibility for me. So we're really interested in the sort of boys rule, girls drool. Do you get a lift if you're a boy and you think boys are better at science? Do you get a lift in your science possible selves if you're a girl and you think girls are better at science? And we found something really interesting. What we found was that for boys and girls, having a boy science bias, this widely held cultural belief that boys are better at science, hurt boys and girls the same when it came to science possible selves. No bias didn't seem to make a difference. And although this wasn't in our publication, for those 6th grade girls, there were quite a few 6th grade girls who thought girls were awesome at science. We saw a little bit of a boost for them, like we might have expected to see for boys. So having a girl science bias seemed to help the girls. It didn't seem to harm the boys, but having a boy science bias, even for boys, made them be less likely to have a science possible self. So the takeaway from this is that a boy science bias was associated with lower science possible selves. And so what do we need to do? What does this mean? What it means is we have to get rid of this cultural bias, this widely held cultural belief that boys are better at science and math. If we do so, we're not going to hurt the boys in any way. And in fact, we're actually going to increase people going into science, boys and girls. And that would broaden science participation and increase our science workforce across the board. So the next question is, well, how do we do that? Because this is a bias that most of us don't even realize that we have. And we're not even really sure how we get it. So I have a couple of videos that I want to show you. They're actually advertisements. And so a lot of times people don't think advertisements impact them. You're like, oh, they don't matter. If they didn't matter, they would not spend millions and billions of dollars on advertisements. So I want you to take a look at both of these commercials to just see both what the barriers are and then maybe how we might combat them.
Who's my pretty girl?
That's so weird about the sound.
Samantha, this project has gotten out of control.
Whoa, hey, careful with that. Why don't you hand that to your brother?
We could just, it's 1 minute, so we could just start at the beginning.
Our words can have a huge impact.
Or can we? Can we start it over?
Isn't it time we told her she's pretty brilliant too? Encourage her love of science and technology and inspire her.
Yeah, it was weird. Let's try one more time. Because it seemed like it was playing and then it got lower.
Who's my pretty girl?
9, 10, 11.
Sammy, sweetie, don't get your dress dirty.
Sam, honey, you don't want to mess with that. Let's put him down.
Samantha, this project has gotten out of control.
Whoa, hey, careful with that. Why don't you hand that to your brother?
So our words can have a huge impact. Isn't it time we told her she's pretty brilliant too? To encourage her love of science and technology. Okay, so see, these are some of the cultural messages that we don't necessarily even realize that we're sending. Again, because we're not aware necessarily that we have them, and but we're imparting them as parents. Okay, so this next one's a little bit more uplifting. So this might be a way that we can combat them, and I hope this video works. All right.
Girls, you think you know what we want, girls. Pink and pretty, it's girls. Just like the 50s, it's girls. You like to buy us pink toys, and everything else is for boys. And you can always get us dolls, and we'll grow up like them balls. It's time to change. We deserve to see a range, 'cause all our toys look just the same, and we would like to use our brains. We are all more than princess maids. Girls who build the spaceships, girls who code the new apps, girls who grow up knowing that they can engineer that. Girls, that's all we really need is girls to bring us up to speed. Girls, our opportunity is girls. Don't underestimate girls. Girls, 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 girls.
Pretty tough. Yeah, so that's to the Beastie Boys song, which is probably the most misogynistic song from the late 80s. But yeah, they co-opted it. So what I wanted to do now is to just open it up for discussion and questions. So as I mentioned, there's so much happening at middle school. So many things could be going on that we don't understand that might reduce girls' interest in science during that time period. So why do you think we might see that? And what can we do about it? Does anybody have any ideas, personal stories, or just questions in general?
Characters, so
Yeah.
I thought that was pretty cool.
I have not got to see that yet. So yes, we need more women mentors in leadership positions and role models so that girls can see themselves, their future possible selves, in those roles. Because if you don't see anyone who looks like you doing those jobs, then it's really hard to see yourself doing that. So yes, definitely. And so it's sort of a double-edged sword though, right? Because it's hard to recruit. But yes, female mentors and role models. Other ideas? In some of the research that we've done, we actually ask kids about things related to science, like how much do you like to discover new things? How curious are you about the world? How much do you like exploring nature? And we particularly leave the word science out of that because we actually think at this point the word science itself is gender-coded and race-coded. It's white and it's male and it's pretty elite, it's pretty upper class. And so we do ask kids, we called this measure discovery orientation, about their interest in these things. I have another example. At Dartmouth, a lot of the students there, they have 50% of women going to engineering at Dartmouth. But they don't call them engineering classes there. They call them design. So the word engineering, the word science, those words at this point are coded. And it's kind of hard. How do we stop using these words when they're so fundamental to how we talk about talk about things. But we do need to think about language. I think that's important. But yeah, it's hard to make things gender neutral, I guess is the point. Yeah. There is definitely a phenomenon where girls are out achieving boys at school generally academically in all fields that we've seen happen. So the academic achievement for girls we see is really high. And there is a leaky pipeline, particularly going from high school to undergraduate. And then that first year of undergraduate, we see a lot of female students go from a STEM major, a science, technology, engineering, or math major into a different major. And so there's some really interesting research just looking at personality and what they find, and I don't know if this can be generalized, but I thought it was fascinating that a lot of times these girls have a really wide range of skills. And so perhaps if they get into a chilly climate where they feel like they're outnumbered or it's not very welcoming, it's really easy to switch to a career like business or a major where you might feel a little bit more welcome or where you might not be the minority because they might be so high achieving in so many different areas. And that's just one theory. But there's lots of different levels of things going on, and I think one of them is just the structure of the institution. And I think it varies from high school to high school. We see tons of variation in course taking in science, but certainly at the undergraduate level, the variation grows in different colleges. Yeah, I think broadening the definition of science and scientists and who does science. In the middle school where we were at, it was really hard because, when you're doing a survey, you're not supposed to tell people the answers, but we had a question, we're like, what kind of job do you want? And it was like a job that uses a lot of science versus none at all. And so we would have students be like, does nursing use a lot of science? And we're like, yes, but they weren't aware. And there's been other studies too, where if you explicitly ask them, they were in some of these enrichment programs for science, and then they followed up with them many years later, and they said, are you in a job in science now? And they're like, no. But then they went in and they looked at the occupation they wrote down. So about 30% said they were in a science career, but it was actually 68% when somebody else coded how much science was in their job. So I think you're absolutely right, just broadening the idea of what is science, what's a science career, how do we use science in all sorts of careers that aren't necessarily like scientists. There is some research that shows, and this is for all parents, but particularly for mothers, if they have math anxiety, that transfers into their children's performance in math. So if they have a lot of math anxiety and their child comes home with math homework and want help, the kids can tell that this is not something that they're comfortable with. And that does subtly sort of move them away. For women who have gotten really beaten up through just basic discrimination, because there's discrimination as well in these institutions and in these roles. You don't want to see your child have to go through that. But what we have to do is a lot of times programs are trying to change individuals to make them hardier or something. And really we have to change institutions so you don't have to get beat up to get through it. Like a lot of people did get beat up in the, blazing those trails and fighting that institutional discrimination. I don't know. Change the institutions to make them more welcoming to all sorts of people in science. I have another grant where I'm looking at women in mathematics in particular, at the undergraduate and graduate level, trying to increase the proportion of women with advanced degrees in mathematics. That's with Judy Walker here at UNL. And what we found is that, they're facing discrimination. They're sort of getting beat up. They're not being taken seriously. There's some microaggressions happening in the classroom, or they're being left out of study groups. And again, we have to change these institutional structures so that's not happening. And the professors have to be aware that these dynamics are happening and take them seriously. But what I can say is that what we have found is that the women who have persisted and have done well, what they do is they find a support group of women who have experienced that. It's sort of like that personal trouble versus public issue type thing. So, if I'm getting beat up or I'm having this really negative experience in a math classroom where I'm not being taken seriously or I'm the only one, what can I do? Well, I can turn to some of my peers who've also been there. And they could say, yeah, I've experienced that. This is what I did. or, you're not alone. Here's some resources, or here's some literature on the fact that you're not alone in experiencing this, and here are ways that I've combated it. But again, that's not really fixing the problem. It's sort of, we're making these individuals work harder to just do the basics when they shouldn't have to, but that's usually what we see for women who've persisted. No, I think you're definitely onto something, and I think that there's a lot of people in formal education through NGSS and trying to bring in sort of authentic, project-based science experiences that we know tend to help keep people who are more diverse and get them more interested in these fields. And then the other thing is we do a lot of informal science education, just making it fun and making it exciting and creative and having a voice. It might be hard to speak up in a classroom. And if science classrooms are taught in, I'm going to memorize the periodic table, that kind of turns people off, or here's the history of science. But if you're actually in there hands-on conducting experiments, and that's not always easy to do in the classroom, but that's why these informal science experiences and after-school programs and CLCs, at the museum, at zoos, making sure those are open to all youth, can really help, I think, give that creative element to keep people more interested. Because if science is just really boring, and on your arts class you get to really express who you are, it's going to make you maybe choose a different path. And science doesn't always get there quick enough, I think, especially at the middle school era. During middle school in particular, I think there's a problem with that. Yes. I think there's a movement towards that, and there's got to be a lot of education for parents just thinking about that encouragement and thinking about science and going into science fields, even if it might not have been your thing when you were younger. But we definitely need to train our teachers to just recognize that we all have these biases, and we might not even realize that when people raise their hands that we're biased on who we're calling on. And there was a really interesting study at Harvard. What they found is, this was in a law school, but there's a lot of bias in law schools too, that they were mostly calling on the male law students. When they actually put someone in the classroom to count who they were calling on, there's something about being watched. It was amazing how that suddenly made parity, because it made them aware. They were like, oh, I didn't even know I was doing this. Now I know that this matters and that I can have an impact if I just really think carefully and make sure that I'm doing this in a systematic way to not leave any voices out. And so there are some classes. I teach a class in the summer to science and math teachers, talking about science identity and these types of issues that I've talked about here today. And I do think the next generation science standards are really focusing on encouraging all kinds of kids. Because even if you're not going to go on and be a scientist, you have to be scientifically literate, right? We have just public education, being able to vote, being able to be an active citizen and make decisions about your health and your life. You need this. So I think it's slow, though. Social change takes a lot of time. It really does. Now, I agree that, especially among faculty members, a lot of full professors have been around a long time. They might not know a lot about some of the social science, these types of ways of thinking and understanding the world. And so certainly trainings on inclusivity and thinking about how do we involve lots of different types of people in the classroom, and how do we not beat them up so much. I had a former student who started out, he was going to be a lawyer, then he did a lot with sociology, and then he decided he wanted to go into computer science. He took a computer science course. And he ended up getting an A in there, but he was like, what's the hardest thing is he gets zero positive reinforcement. Like he was used to in his sociology courses and his other courses, just when you did a good job, somebody telling you that you did a good job. And when he was in that computer science course, he was like 0. They just marked everything up. But he was doing a good job. He got an A. But he said it was really shocking to him going from the sort of culture of being a social science major and then taking some more advanced computer science and math courses, not having that positive reinforcement. And then there's just the negative. I've heard horror stories, and some of my research just interviewing people who have dropped out of STEM fields and some of the experiences they've had with professors. And I don't know how to solve that problem except training, but they're very resistant. We've had implicit bias trainings here, and yeah. No, there's this really great article that just came out in 2017 in the journal Social Sciences called Weeded Out. And what they looked at is that introductory calculus course among STEM majors for men and women, first year, who had already declared a STEM major, and then they took their first calculus course. What they found is the men were more likely to fail, but not by a lot. But their reaction to failing was to just keep going. And the girls, they dropped out. And so there's certainly, it's perfectionism, and I would also say just a confidence bias. Just that, just thinking that, like, it's interesting because I think the confidence bias is actually not girls, it's guys who are overconfident. I don't know how to say, hey, you shouldn't be so confident. Like, you should have a more accurate view of your abilities here. You don't want to take anybody down. We want to be positive, right? But at the same time, yeah, that is a huge, and you see it in that article, it's really, really stark contrast. If you fail a course and you're a woman, you fail that first calculus course, you're much more likely to change degrees out of a STEM field. And again, we shouldn't be using these courses as weed out courses. Why are we weeding people out? Because who are we weeding out? Women, people of color. We're not weeding out other people. You know what I mean? It's not just weeding out people who can't do it. It's weeding out people who don't have the confidence to persist after getting a failing grade. But it's not ability, because they're having the same experiences, and it's hard for everyone. Engineering's hard. Science is really hard. Math is really hard. But it's the reaction to the failure or to that negative experience to where you decide to change fields that I think we need to change, or just not have these courses that weed people out disproportionately. When we see that they're having that disproportionate impact and it has nothing to do with their ability, then we need to do something different in those courses. Now, we definitely need to rethink how we transition high schoolers into college, and to make sure if they don't have access to all those AP courses, or they didn't have the same opportunities a lot of kids have in, say, urban schools versus rural schools, or that the supports we're giving them don't seem remedial. Because a lot of times they do. Oh, you need extra help. Well, that doesn't feel good either. So how can we bring youth in and not have it seem remedial, bring in these high schoolers, but give them some help in that transition? And I mean, I think we could probably brainstorm a lot of different solutions and assess them, but I do think we just need to change the courses and then how we support people of color, people coming from schools that are lower income. It kind of comes back to that Harvard study I was talking about. Making people aware of them is the first step. So I know I have biases, maybe in who I'm calling on in class, maybe when I see someone's name on an application. There's been some really interesting studies just where if instead of putting a first name or changing the names or making it so that's not so apparent, that can help. Like, it's a strategy that a teacher could take to make sure that they're not letting those implicit cultural biases influence how they're actually grading or interacting with students. So really, it's just sort of self-awareness and having, I guess, sort of that vulnerability of understanding that you're fallible. We all have human brains. We all make mistakes and generalizations and mess up sometimes, but being aware that that's systematic. And then there are just really clear things that people figured out you can do, which is sort of blinded grading. That's pretty much the big one. Having somebody there watching you, that's a good one, knowing you're being watched, making sure, or having someone checking to make sure that you aren't having those systematic biases. But that's a hard position to voluntarily enter, but I hope that more faculty members will think about taking on those strategies because we all have these biases. Now, how to change them, I think we just need more role models. And we really need to pay attention to textbooks, media, the messages that we are even, if somebody says something like, oh, this cop pulled me over, I automatically say, oh, what did he say? I mean, we all are doing this all of the time, taking these shortcuts. So stopping ourselves and not doing that, and not assuming gender based on occupation, and keeping that open while we're interacting with our youth. Yeah, I wish I had more answers, you guys. We're getting there, though, I think.